Wade Holloway turned the valve at 6:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, same as he'd done every April for the last 11 years. And by 6:52 a.m., there were 3 sheriff's cruisers blocking Cattleman's Bend, and a woman in yoga pants filming him through a chain-link fence like he was defusing a bomb. The valve in question sat inside a cinder-block pump house on the back 40 of what used to be, in its entirety, the Holloway family cattle ranch. Now it was 4 acres of scrubland, with a well, a pressure tank, a 100-gallon-a-minute pump, and 1,100 feet of buried PVC pipe that fed exactly 12 homes on a horseshoe street called Homestead Loop, inside a subdivision that had been carved out of Wade's father's grazing land in 1997 and christened, by a developer with more ambition than imagination, Pinnacle Ranch Estates. Wade had signed the paperwork himself. He remembered it clearly, because his hand had shaken doing it, not from doubt, but from the particular grief of watching 4 generations of cattle land get subdivided into cul-de-sacs with names like Windmill Way and Saddle Ridge Court. He'd kept 40 acres and the well. The well was non-negotiable. His grandfather had drilled it in 1951, and it had never gone dry, not during the 80s drought, not during the one in 2011 that turned half the county's stock tanks to cracked mud. When the developer's engineers realized the new subdivision's municipal water line was going to cost an extra $340,000 to extend that far out, somebody had the idea to just keep using the Holloway well for the 12 lots closest to it. Wade said yes on one condition. It went in writing, it got recorded with the county, and he stayed in charge of the pump. That document was called the Well and Water Rights Agreement, recorded April 3, 1998, instrument number 98-11402, Larkin County Clerk's Office, State of Texas. It said, in plain, unambiguous English, that Wade had made the lawyer read back to him twice, that Wade Holloway, or his heirs, would own, operate, and maintain the well and pump system in perpetuity, that the 12 benefiting homeowners, and later their homeowners association, would pay a monthly water system fee of $40 per household directly to Wade to cover electricity and upkeep, and that Wade retained the unilateral right to shut the system down for up to 24 hours per calendar year for required maintenance, provided he gave 48 hours written notice to the association's management. He'd given that notice, certified mail, signature required, delivered April 9th to the offices of Cornerstone Community Management, the outfit Pinnacle Ranch Estates paid to handle its books and mailers. He'd also emailed a courtesy copy to the HOA board's general inbox, the one listed on the community website, the one that funneled straight to whoever happened to be board president that year. That year, the board president was a woman named Denise Kirkpatrick, and Denise Kirkpatrick did not read her HOA email. Denise Kirkpatrick had, in fact, unilaterally decided 6 months earlier that the water thing, as she called it in board minutes, was a liability the association needed to bring in-house, and had quietly hired a contractor, Feldman Mechanical, owned by her husband's college roommate, to assess the system without notifying Wade, without amending the recorded agreement, and without a license to touch a private well in the state of Texas. Wade didn't know any of that yet on the morning of April 14th. All he knew was that he'd flipped a valve to relieve pressure on a pump that was making a grinding sound he didn't like, and 40 minutes later, there were flashing lights at his gate. Denise Kirkpatrick had called 911 at 6:31 a.m. and told the dispatcher that someone had shut off the water to her entire street, that she suspected deliberate tampering with critical infrastructure, and that she wanted it treated as a possible act of sabotage. She used that word, sabotage. The Larkin County Sheriff's non-emergency line got a second call 4 minutes later from a different Homestead Loop resident, who simply wanted to know why her shower had stopped mid-rinse. But by then, the first call had already been logged as a Priority 2 infrastructure incident, and 2 deputies were rolling. Wade met them at the gate in the same barn coat he'd worn to feed cattle that didn't exist anymore, holding a pressure switch he'd been about to replace, looking exactly like what he was, a 68-year-old man doing routine maintenance on equipment he had legally owned since before some of these deputies were born. He explained the agreement. He explained the notice. He offered to walk them to the certified mail receipt sitting on his kitchen table. One of the deputies, a younger man who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, radioed it in as a civil matter. Denise Kirkpatrick, standing at the fence line in yoga pants with her phone held sideways, was not satisfied with that determination, and said so, loudly, for the benefit of the 11 other residents who had by now wandered out of their houses in various states of undress to find out why nothing came out of their faucets. She told the deputies Wade was unstable. She told them he'd threatened the entire street. She told the growing crowd that this was exactly the kind of thing she'd warned the board about, that a private citizen should never have been allowed to control something as essential as water, and somewhere in there, she used the word terrorism, quietly enough that it didn't make the sheriff's report, but loudly enough that 4 different neighbors heard it, and one of them posted it to the Pinnacle Ranch Estates Facebook group by 8 a.m. under the caption, "Homestead Loop Water Crisis. Is our HOA president overreacting, or is this guy dangerous?" with a screenshot of Wade's driveway. By 9 that morning, water was back on. The pressure switch had been swapped in the 20 minutes Wade actually needed, exactly as scheduled, exactly as it said on the certified mail notice nobody had bothered to read. The sheriff's deputies left, the crowd dispersed, and Wade Holloway stood in his driveway holding an old pressure switch in one gloved hand, looking at a Facebook thread with 41 comments, already accusing him of everything from senility to eco-terrorism, and understood, with the calm of a man who'd spent 30 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, reading infrastructure the way other men read box scores, that this was not actually over. This was the opening bell. Drop your city, and tell me, do you live in an HOA? I want to know how many are watching from behind enemy lines right now. To understand how a routine pressure switch became a criminal complaint, you have to understand what Pinnacle Ranch Estates actually was, which was a subdivision built on the bones of something real and dressed up to look like something it never earned the right to be called. The streets had ranch names: Cattleman's Bend, Windmill Way, Saddle Ridge Court, but nobody on them had ever worked cattle, and the closest thing to a windmill was a decorative one bolted to a mailbox post by a resident who'd been fined $75 for unauthorized structural addition under CC&R Section 9.3, before the board relented and grandfathered it in. The entrance sign featured a wrought iron longhorn silhouette that the developer had ordered from a catalog in Ohio. It was, in short, exactly the kind of place that sells itself on the aesthetics of a working ranch, while fining anyone who actually keeps chickens. Wade Holloway's property sat at the far northern edge, separated from the subdivision proper by a low rail fence that had been there since 1979, and a stand of live oaks his grandfather had planted as a windbreak. His house was the original ranch house, 1962, limestone, a wraparound porch his late wife Carol had insisted on screening in before she passed in 2019, and it looked, next to the beige stucco production homes of Homestead Loop, like a photograph that had wandered into the wrong album. Some of the newer residents genuinely didn't know, when they moved in, that the crusty old rancher on the hill owned the water under their feet. Some of them found out the way half of Homestead Loop found out on April 14th, with sirens. Wade had been on the Pinnacle Ranch Estates HOA's radar for years, in the low-grade, background way that any anomaly gets noticed by people who've decided uniformity is a virtue. He didn't paint his fence the approved canyon taupe. He didn't have to. His fence predated the CC&Rs by 19 years, a fact he'd had to point out in writing twice. He kept 2 horses in a rebuilt barn that violated, technically, Section 6.1's prohibition on livestock, except that Section 6.1 also contained a clause, buried in subsection D, specifically exempting grandfathered agricultural use, predating original recordation, which existed for the sole reason of covering Wade Holloway and nobody else, because he was the only person in Pinnacle Ranch Estates who'd ever had a legal right to a horse in the first place. None of that had ever been a real problem until Denise Kirkpatrick got elected board president in January of that year, running on a platform, and she did run on one, with actual yard signs, of protecting property values, and finally getting Pinnacle Ranch Estates the professional management it deserves. Denise had moved in 3 years earlier from a much larger, much stricter master-planned community, 40 miles east, the kind with a 50-page architectural guideline and a full-time compliance officer, and she had made no secret of the fact that she found Pinnacle Ranch Estates, with its recorded easements and its grandfather clauses and its one weird water arrangement with the old rancher, embarrassingly loose. She'd brought 2 allies onto the board with her, Gary Feldman as treasurer, a soft-spoken man who mostly did what Denise asked and happened, not at all coincidentally, to be the cousin of the contractor Denise had quietly hired to assess the water system, and Priscilla Wynne as secretary, who kept the minutes and, residents would later discover, had a habit of keeping them selectively. She had also, in her first month, made an example of somebody else entirely, a fact that would matter more later than it seemed to at the time. The Diaz family had moved into 14 Windmill Way the previous summer, and by February had run afoul of Denise in a way that had nothing to do with water and everything to do with the particular flavor of authority Denise liked to exercise. Marco and Elena Diaz had 2 boys under 10 and a modest above-ground pool they'd installed for the summer, purchased and permitted through the county, sitting in their backyard behind a 6-foot privacy fence that met every setback requirement in the CC&Rs. Denise, touring the neighborhood one Saturday in her capacity as newly elected president, had spotted the top rim of the pool over the fence line from the street and decided, without consulting the architectural review committee that technically existed for exactly this purpose, that it violated Section 8.2's prohibition on visible recreational structures altering the community's aesthetic character. The Diazes received a notice of violation on February 19th, assessing a $500 fine and a 30-day removal order. Marco Diaz, a soft-spoken machinist who worked 12-hour shifts and did not have the time, money, or appetite for a fight, simply paid it and drained the pool the following weekend rather than argue with a board he assumed knew what it was doing. It was a small thing in the scheme of the year Denise Kirkpatrick was about to have. $500, 1 deflated pool, 2 disappointed kids. But it would resurface in August in a way nobody, least of all Denise, saw coming. Now that you know Wade, has your HOA ever pulled something that made your blood boil? Tell me the worst thing your HOA has done. The water system fee, that $40 a month specified in the 1998 agreement, meant to go straight to Wade for electricity and upkeep, had, sometime around 2015, gotten folded into the general HOA assessment under a previous, more careless board, and Wade had simply been getting paid out of the HOA's operating account ever since, instead of collecting it door to door. It was sloppier than it should have been, but it worked, until Denise Kirkpatrick looked at the books in February and decided that $480 a year per household, times 12 households, flowing out to some guy for a well he happened to own, looked less like an easement fee and more like a line item she could get credit for cutting. She didn't cut it, she rerouted it. Board minutes from the February 11th meeting, the ones Priscilla Wynne recorded, and which Wade would not see for another 6 weeks, show the board voting 2-1, with Gary abstaining on the grounds that it was a conflict, sort of, to redirect $2,880 of the annual water system fee toward what the minutes describe only as infrastructure modernization consulting, which was, in fact, 4 site visits from Feldman Mechanical, an HVAC and general contracting outfit with no well license, no water system certification, and no idea what a pressure switch was until Gary's cousin looked it up. Wade received one email from Denise in March, informal, unsigned by the board as a body, informing him that the association is exploring options to modernize water infrastructure management going forward, and that your continued cooperation would be appreciated. He responded, in writing, that the 1998 agreement was still in force, still recorded with the county, and that any modification would require his written consent and a formal amendment. He heard nothing back. He assumed, reasonably, that the matter had died the way most HOA overreach dies, quietly, when someone finally reads the paperwork. It had not died. It had simply gone underground, the way a grass fire will smolder under dry brush for weeks before it finds wind. The letter arrived April 22nd, 8 days after the sheriff's cruisers, hand-delivered to Wade's mailbox in a Cornerstone Community Management envelope with a certified mail sticker that hadn't even been through the post office. Someone had just walked it up the drive and shoved it in. It was a notice of violation, CC&R, Section 7.4, Utility Systems and Shared Infrastructure, subsection C, which the letter quoted as prohibiting any owner from unilaterally interrupting a utility service relied upon by other members without prior board approval. It cited the events of April 14th. It assessed a fine of $15,000, payable within 30 days, for unauthorized disruption of critical community water service and resulting emergency response costs. And it noted, almost as an afterthought in the final paragraph, that the board is additionally reviewing the association's water infrastructure arrangement to determine whether the current management structure remains appropriate. Wade read it twice at his kitchen table, in the same chair he'd read the original 1998 agreement in 26 years earlier, and laughed. A short, dry sound, more disbelief than humor. Section 7.4 did exist. He'd read every CC&R amendment since 1998 out of the same habit that had kept him reading engineering specs for 3 decades. Trust nothing you haven't verified yourself. But 7.4 Manus governed utilities the association itself owned and operated, the shared irrigation line for the entrance landscaping, the retention pond pump. It said nothing, could say nothing, about a privately owned well system operating under a separately recorded easement agreement that predated the CC&Rs entirely. The board didn't have jurisdiction to fine him under 7.4, any more than they had jurisdiction to fine his neighbor's dog for barking on Wade's own property. He wrote back, calmly, in the flat declarative sentences of a man who'd spent his career writing incident reports that had to hold up to scrutiny from people who wanted them to say something else. He cited instrument number 98-11402. He enclosed a copy of the certified mail receipt from April 9th, proving 48 hours' notice had been given, exactly as the recorded agreement required. He noted that the well and water rights agreement took precedence over any subsequently adopted CC&R provision as a matter of Texas property law, since a recorded easement cannot be unilaterally overridden by a homeowners association's internal rules. He requested, in writing, a copy of the board resolution authorizing the fine, per Texas Property Code Section 209.006, which requires HOAs to provide owners written notice and an opportunity to be heard before levying an assessment for a rule violation. He got a hearing date instead of an answer. May 6th, 7 p.m. The Pinnacle Ranch Estates Clubhouse, a beige stucco building, with a conference room that smelled permanently of chlorine from the adjacent pool. 14 residents showed up, which was more than had shown up to a board meeting in the association's history, and Wade understood, walking in, that most of them weren't there for him. They were there because their water had gone out for one confusing morning, and they wanted somebody to have a story about it, and stories need a villain. Denise Kirkpatrick ran the hearing like a woman who had already decided the outcome, and was merely allowing the room the courtesy of watching her arrive at it. She read the violation into the record. She played, on her phone, a video clip from the Facebook group, someone's Ring doorbell footage of the sheriff's cruisers, as if it were evidence of Wade's guilt rather than evidence of her own 911 call. When Wade tried to introduce the 1998 agreement and the certified mail receipt, she said, "We can look at your paperwork later, Mr. Holloway. This is a hearing about the incident," which was, procedurally, backwards, since the paperwork was the entire question of whether an incident requiring board jurisdiction had even occurred. Gary Feldman said almost nothing. Priscilla Wynn took minutes that would later, when Wade finally got his hands on them, describe his calm recitation of a recorded legal instrument as Mr. Holloway became argumentative and refused to accept responsibility. The board voted 2-1 to uphold the $15,000 fine. Gary abstained again. The one dissenting vote came from a fourth board member, a quiet man named Ted Alvarez who'd been elected the same January as Denise but hadn't run on her slate, and who told Wade afterward, in the parking lot, in a low voice, that he'd read the recorded agreement that afternoon and didn't understand how the board had jurisdiction at all, but that he'd been outvoted on procedure before he even got to the merits. Wade drove home past his own well house, past the pump that had never once failed a Homestead Loop faucet in 26 years, and sat on his porch until well after dark. Carol would have known exactly what to say. Carol had always been the one who translated Wade's flat competence into something the world could hear as reasonable rather than stubborn. He missed her most, he'd found, not during the big anniversaries, but during moments precisely like this one, a $15,000 fine for a task he'd performed lawfully, correctly, and on schedule, levied by a board that hadn't bothered to read its own governing documents. But Wade Holloway had not spent 3 decades in the Army Corps of Engineers by getting angry in ways that didn't produce results. He got up the next morning, made coffee, and started a file. The county clerk's office reopened at 8 a.m. Over the following 2 weeks, while the $15,000 fine sat unpaid and the clock on it ticked toward a 15-day escalation clause the HOA's own collection policy allowed, Wade requested, under Texas Property Code Section 209.005, which grants association members the right to inspect HOA books and records, every financial document related to the water system fee since 2015. He requested the full board meeting minutes for the preceding 18 months. He requested any contracts, invoices, or correspondence involving Feldman Mechanical, Cornerstone Community Management, the outside firm that handled the paperwork, was legally obligated to comply within 10 business days. It took them 22, and what arrived was incomplete. 3 months of minutes missing entirely, invoices with line items redacted per board instruction, a response letter that misquoted the statute governing the request. Wade filed a follow-up request, citing the specific statutory violation of the delay. He also, quietly, drove 40 miles to the county courthouse and pulled a certified copy of Instrument Number 98-11402 himself, just to have his own clean copy that no HOA management company could misplace, redact, or accidentally fail to produce. He was not, yet, thinking lawsuit. He was thinking the way he'd thought for 30 years about failing infrastructure. Find the actual point of failure before you start welding. $15,000 over a scheduled water system maintenance he gave 48 hours legal notice for, against a 68-year-old retired engineer who's owned that well since before the HOA existed. Is this legal where you live? What would you have done? The lien notice came on June 3rd. Wade had not paid the $15,000, on the advice of nobody but his own reading of the statute, which held that a homeowners association cannot record a lien for an assessment it lacked jurisdiction to levy in the first place. But that argument requires a judge to agree with it, and Denise Kirkpatrick was not interested in waiting for a judge. The Pinnacle Ranch Estates HOA, acting through its collections attorney, filed a notice of assessment lien against Wade's 40 acres with the Lien County Clerk in the amount of $15,000 plus $1,240 in administrative and legal costs, with language stating that failure to satisfy the lien within 90 days could result in foreclosure proceedings against the property. That word, foreclosure, landed on Wade the way it lands on everyone it's ever aimed at, with the particular, specific terror of a threat against the one thing that cannot be replaced. This wasn't a beige production house he could sell and start over somewhere else. This was his grandfather's well, his father's barn, the porch Carol had screened in with her own 2 hands, supervising a contractor she didn't fully trust. The idea that a board of 3 people, one of whom hadn't lived in Texas long enough to know what a windmill actually did, could put that land at risk over a maintenance task performed lawfully and on schedule was the kind of thing that would have broken a lesser sense of order. It also, predictably, hit the Facebook group. Someone, Wade suspected Gary Feldman's wife, though he never proved it, posted a photo of the recorded lien alongside a caption that read, "Guess the water guy finally got what's coming to him," and the comments underneath ran 40+ deep, with a mixture of gleeful vindication and genuine confusion from residents who, when they actually thought about it, realized they had no idea why their water bill had quietly gone up $12 a month that spring to cover water system administrative overhead, a line item that hadn't existed before Denise's board took over. The social cost compounded. A woman 2 doors down from the Loop's entrance, whose kids had ridden their bikes past Wade's fence for years to look at the horses, stopped letting them go that way. A man Wade had known since the subdivision broke ground, who used to wave from his truck every morning, started taking the long way around. At the feed store in town, the woman behind the counter, who'd known Wade's father, asked him, not unkindly, if it was true he'd cut off the whole street's water out of spite, because that was the version that had made it 40 miles into town before the facts did. Marco Diaz, of all people, was the one neighbor who didn't flinch. He knocked on Wade's door one evening in mid-June, still in his work coveralls, and said he'd read about the lien on the Facebook group and wanted Wade to know that he, too, had gotten a violation notice from Denise's board that made no sense, the pool, back in February, and had simply paid it because he didn't have the stomach for a fight with people who controlled his HOA dues. He said he was sorry he hadn't fought it, and that if Wade ever needed a second signature on anything, he had one. It was a small gesture, and it would turn out to matter a great deal more than either man expected that night. Wade's own attorney, he'd finally hired one, a real estate and property litigation specialist out of the county seat named Marisol Reyes, who took one look at instrument number 98-11402 and the recorded lien, and said, with the flat professional satisfaction of someone who does not often get handed a case this clean, they filed a lien against a recorded easement holder for exercising a contractual right he gave 48 hours notice for. I need you to understand how badly they've stepped in it. Marisol's first move was to send a formal demand letter requiring the HOA to release the lien within 14 days, or face a suit for slander of title, a wrongful lien claim, and attorney's fees under the same property code section that governed the botched records request. The board did not release the lien within 14 days. Denise Kirkpatrick, in an email Wade's attorney would later enter as evidence, told her fellow board members that backing down now sends the wrong message to the whole community about who's really in charge out here, a sentence that would prove to be the single most expensive thing anyone in Pinnacle Ranch Estates said all year. Wade sat with all of it, the lien, the whispers, the kids not riding past the fence anymore, and made the decision that would define the rest of the story. He was not going to simply win a lawsuit and disappear back onto his 40 acres to live out his years muttering about it. He was going to make sure no board in Pinnacle Ranch Estates or anywhere else in Lien County ever tried this again. The fight back started, as these things often do, with paperwork nobody wanted him to see. The delayed and redacted records Wade had finally forced out of Cornerstone Community Management under a second statutory demand. This one drafted by Marisol Reyes, citing the specific penalty provisions for non-compliance, arrived complete in late June, and Wade spent 4 straight nights at his kitchen table, going through 18 months of invoices with the same methodical patience he'd once applied to reading blueprints for a levy that couldn't afford to be wrong. What he found was this. Feldman Mechanical had billed the HOA $11,600 across 4 site assessments of the well system between February and April, despite holding no water system operator's license in the state of Texas, a license the state required for exactly the kind of pressure and pump work the invoices described. 2 of the 4 invoices were dated for site visits that, per Wade's own security camera footage, the one he'd installed on the pump house years ago after a coyote problem, and which he had, fortunately, never gotten around to deleting the archive on, never actually happened. The trucks weren't there. The work wasn't done. The HOA had paid $5,800 for site visits that existed only on paper. Separately, the water system fee, the $40 per household line item that was supposed to flow to Wade, showed a gap. Between March and June, the HOA had collected the full $480 per household annualized rate from all 12 Homestead Loop residents, but had paid Wade nothing, on the stated rationale, buried in an internal memo from Denise to Gary, that payments are on hold, pending resolution of the infrastructure matter. That was $1,920 quietly retained by the association, on top of the phantom Feldman Mechanical invoices, on top of $15,000 in fines the HOA had no jurisdiction to levy, on top of a lien that put Wade's ancestral land at risk. While Wade worked through the water fee documents, he noticed something else buried in the same 18 months of minutes. The Diaz pool violation from February, and beside it, in Priscilla Wynn's own handwriting in the margin of a printed agenda, Wade had specifically requested in full a note that read, "Handled quietly, no ARC review needed, DK approval sufficient," which was itself a violation of the association's own architectural review procedure, requiring a 3-person committee sign-off, not a unilateral call from the board president. Marco Diaz's $500 fine, in other words, had been every bit as jurisdictionally hollow as Wade's $15,000 one, just smaller and paid without a fight. Wade just made a critical move. He pulled 18 months of HOA financial records and cross-referenced them against his own security footage to prove the board paid a contractor for site visits that never happened. Was that the right call? What's your strategy? Marisol Reyes took the security footage discrepancy and the invoice records to a forensic accountant, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, who did contract work for exactly this kind of dispute, and Priya's report, delivered in mid-July, 11 pages, meticulously footnoted, confirmed what Wade already suspected. At least $7,720 in HOA funds had been disbursed for work, either not performed or performed by an unlicensed contractor with a personal relationship to a sitting board member, a textbook conflict of interest violation under Section 209.0052 of the Texas Property Code, which requires HOA board members to disclose financial interests in any contract the association enters. Wade did not stop there. He filed a formal complaint with the Texas Real Estate Commission's Dispute Resolution Division, since Cornerstone Community Management held a license the state could actually discipline. He also, on Marisol's recommendation, sent a detailed letter to the Lien County District Attorney's Consumer Protection Unit, outlining the phantom invoices and the undisclosed conflict of interest, not because he expected criminal charges immediately, but because a formal referral on file changes how quickly everyone else starts taking a matter seriously. And then Wade did something Denise Kirkpatrick had not anticipated at all. He ran for the board himself. Pinnacle Ranch Estates bylaws allowed for a special election if enough homeowners petitioned for one, following a documented breach of fiduciary duty, a mechanism almost nobody in the subdivision's history had ever bothered to invoke, because almost nobody had ever cared enough about board business to gather signatures. Wade, with the quiet, methodical persistence of a man who'd once gotten an entire Army Corps district to agree on a floodwall spec, went door to door on Homestead Loop and beyond, not asking anyone to take his side on the water dispute specifically, but simply asking them to look at the numbers Priya Chandrasekaran had put together and decide for themselves whether they wanted a board that operated like this. It took him 19 days to gather the signatures the bylaws required, 20% of the association's membership, which came out to 31 households out of Pinnacle Ranch Estates' full 154. He got 38. Some signed because they genuinely reviewed the financials and were furious. Some signed because their own water bill had gone up $12 a month for reasons nobody had ever explained to them. A few signed simply because Ted Alvarez, the one board member who'd voted against the fine back in May, went with Wade on several of those door visits and vouched for him personally, which mattered more in a place like Pinnacle Ranch Estates than any spreadsheet ever could. Marco Diaz signed on the second day and brought his own quiet documentation of the pool fine to add to Wade's file, proof, however small, of a pattern rather than an isolated dispute. News of the phantom invoices, the conflict of interest, and the recall petition reached the local news the same week because one of Wade's Homestead Loop neighbors, the same woman who'd stopped letting her kids ride bikes past his fence, in fact, once she'd actually read Priya's report, reached out to KVTX7, the regional affiliate out of the county seat, whose consumer investigations reporter, a sharp, unbothered woman named Dana Okafor, had done 2 prior segments on HOA overreach and smelled a good one from the first phone call. Dana Okafor's segment aired on a Thursday evening broadcast, opening with drone footage of Wade's well house and the 12 homes it served, and moving through the numbers with the specific, damning clarity that only comes from a reporter who's actually read the documents rather than just quoting a press release. It featured an on-camera interview with Wade, flat, calm, factual, letting the paperwork do the emotional work for him, and a doorstep confrontation with Denise Kirkpatrick, who told Dana Okafor's camera, "No comment," 4 times before closing the door. Footage that would end up looped on every local aggregator site in the region by the following morning. The segment also mentioned in its closing 30 seconds the smaller Diaz pool fine as an example of a pattern of enforcement without proper committee review, a detail that made Denise's jaw visibly tighten in a follow-up clip Dana Okafor posted to the station's own social account. $7,720 in fines paid to a contractor with no license and a personal connection to the board president, against $15,000 fined to the man who'd owned that well legally since before the HOA existed, against Wade. Is this legal where you live? What would you have done? The Texas Real Estate Commission opened a formal inquiry into Cornerstone Community Management's licensing compliance within a week of Wade's complaint, a fact that got its own follow-up mention on KVTX7's website. The Larkin County District Attorney's Office, facing a documented conflict of interest complaint, a forensic accounting report, and a news segment that had already made the case publicly, could no longer treat the matter as a low-priority civil squabble. The Consumer Protection Unit opened its own review of the Feldman mechanical invoices, with an eye toward whether the phantom site visits constituted actionable fraud against the association's own membership. None of that, on its own, forced Denise Kirkpatrick's hand. What forced it was the recall election. The special meeting was set for August 19th, 7 p.m., the same clubhouse conference room that still smelled of chlorine, except this time there were 61 residents in a room built for maybe 40, folding chairs pulled in from the pool deck, and a second overflow group standing in the doorway because the fire code wouldn't let any more inside. Denise Kirkpatrick opened the meeting the way she'd opened the hearing back in May, trying to control the frame before anyone else could, describing the recall effort as a coordinated attack orchestrated by a disgruntled property owner with a financial grudge, a characterization that might have worked in January, before the KVTX7 segment, before the forensic report, before 38 signatures worth of neighbors had done their own reading. "With respect," Marisol Reyes said, standing to address the room once Denise finished, "the only grudge on record belongs to the association, which filed a lien against a man's ancestral property for exercising a legal right under an instrument recorded in this county 26 years before your board took office." She laid out the recorded easement, the certified mail notice, the jurisdictional problem with the original fine, and the lien that should never have been filed, in the flat, unadorned language of a lawyer who knows the facts are doing all the necessary work and doesn't need to embellish them. Priya Chandrasekaran presented the financial findings next. The $7,720 in questionable Feldman mechanical payments, the $1,920 in water system fees withheld from Wade without authorization, the conflict of interest never disclosed to the membership as required under Section 209.0052. A murmur went through the folding chairs when she put the invoice dates side by side with Wade's time-stamped security footage on the projector screen, showing an empty gravel lot on the exact day Feldman Mechanical had billed for a 4-hour site visit. Marco Diaz stood up from the third row, unprompted, and asked to speak. "I paid $500 in February for a pool my kids barely got to use, because the letter said the board already made its decision and there was nothing to appeal," he said. "I want to know if that decision ever actually went through committee, or if it was just Denise deciding on her own, same as everything else." Priscilla Wynn, 3 seats down from Denise at the board table, did not look up from her notepad. Ted Alvarez, the board's 4th member, stood up in front of the room and did something that took Denise Kirkpatrick visibly by surprise. He apologized. Not for opposing her, he'd done that from the start, but for not fighting harder in February when the water fee redirection first came to a vote, for assuming procedure would eventually correct itself, for underestimating how far it would go before somebody outside the board had to force the correction. "I should have said something the day Marco's pool fine came across my desk with no committee sign-off," he added. "I didn't connect it to what was happening to Wade until this month. I'm not proud of that." Denise Kirkpatrick, for her part, did not yield easily. She accused Marisol Reyes of grandstanding for a lawsuit, accused Dana Okafor's news segment of selective editing, and told the room, at one point, that every board makes decisions people don't like. That's what leadership looks like. It was Gary Feldman, unexpectedly, who cracked the room's patience entirely, standing halfway through Denise's rebuttal to say, quietly but audibly, "I think we should just let people vote," before sitting back down without meeting anyone's eyes. The recall vote, when it finally happened by paper ballot at 9:40 p.m., removed Denise Kirkpatrick from the board by a count of 54-7. Gary Feldman resigned his position before the ballots were even fully counted, standing up mid-tally and walking out to a silence that said more than any vote could have. Priscilla Wynn was not on the recall ballot. Her term wasn't up for another year, but she resigned 2 weeks later anyway, citing personal reasons in a one-line email to the remaining board. The new board, seated the following week on an emergency interim basis pending full elections, included Ted Alvarez as acting president, and, after some persuasion that took Marisol Reyes exactly 1 phone call to accomplish, Wade Holloway himself, not because he wanted the position, but because the remaining homeowners, in the specific and pointed way that communities sometimes decide these things, wanted the man who'd caught the fraud to be the man who oversaw its cleanup. Marco Diaz was appointed to the newly reconstituted Architectural Review Committee, The same body Denise had bypassed to find his pool in the first place, on the theory, voiced by Ted Alvarez at the same meeting, that the person most recently burned by a broken process was exactly who should help fix it. After everything Wade went through, was it worth it? Have you fought your HOA? Won or walked away? Tell me your story. The settlement, finalized in October through Marisol Reyes and the association's own newly hired outside counsel, not Denise Kirkpatrick's former collections attorney, who'd been let go within days of the recall, released the lien on Wade's property in full, refunded the $15,000 fine with interest calculated from the date of the original hearing, and reimbursed him the $1,920 in withheld water system fees. The HOA's insurance carrier, facing the documented conflict of interest finding, separately paid out a further $9,500 to cover the phantom Feldman mechanical invoices and associated legal costs, money the association's new treasurer used to fund an actual, licensed inspection of the well system, the first one anyone besides Wade himself had ever properly commissioned, which came back with a single finding. The system was in excellent condition, exactly as Wade had maintained it for 26 years without incident, right up until somebody who didn't understand it decided she knew better. Marco Diaz's $500 pool fine was refunded as part of the same settlement package, along with a formal written acknowledgement from the new board that the original violation had never received the committee review the CC&Rs required. He put the pool back up the following June. His boys were, by all accounts, thrilled. The Texas Real Estate Commission's inquiry into Cornerstone Community Management concluded with a formal reprimand and a $4,000 fine against the firm for records request noncompliance, along with a mandated audit of every other HOA account the company managed in Lien County, an audit that turned up, in two unrelated subdivisions, its own smaller irregularities, which is the kind of thing that happens once someone finally checks. The Lien County District Attorney's Consumer Protection Unit declined to pursue criminal charges against Denise Kirkpatrick, or Gary Feldman's cousin at Feldman Mechanical, citing insufficient evidence of intentional fraud versus negligent billing, a decision that frustrated some of the Homestead Loop residents who'd wanted a cleaner ending, but which didn't much bother Wade, who'd never been chasing anyone's jail sentence, only his land, his name, and the plain fact of who'd been telling the truth. The CC&Rs were formally amended at the next annual meeting, incorporating a new Section 7.4 that explicitly recognized privately held utility easements as governed by their own recorded instruments and outside board enforcement jurisdiction, and a revised Section 8.2 requiring any structural violation to pass through the full three-person architectural review committee before a fine could be issued, language drafted, at the new board's request, by Marisol Reyes herself, specifically so that no future board of Pinnacle Ranch Estates could make either of Denise Kirkpatrick's mistakes again, whether out of ignorance or ambition. Denise Kirkpatrick sold her house on Windmill Way in November and moved, according to the Facebook group nobody had bothered to remove her from yet, back east to the stricter 50-page architectural guideline community she'd come from originally, a fact that struck more than one longtime Homestead Loop resident as the tidiest kind of ending available. Wade Holloway still gets up most mornings and checks the pump house, same as he has for 26 years, same as his father did before him, and his grandfather before that. The horses are still there. The fence is still canyon tope adjacent and grandfathered, and nobody's said a word about it since August. Once a year, in April, he still shuts the system down for 24 hours to do the maintenance it needs. And now, instead of certified mail vanishing into a management company's inbox, the notice goes out through a community text alert system Ted Alvarez set up specifically so nobody ever has to find out about a scheduled maintenance window from a deputy at their front gate again. The kids ride their bikes past his fence to look at the horses every afternoon after school. A couple of them wave. Marco Diaz's boys are usually among them, and on hot Saturdays, Wade's occasionally seen leaning on his rail fence watching them cannonball into that same pool that once cost their family $500 they never should have had to pay. That's the story. If your HOA has ever tried to fine you for something they had no right to touch, or if you've ever had to go digging through your own board's books to find out what they were really doing with your money, you know exactly how this one felt from the inside. So tell me down in the comments, and hit subscribe, because HOA Horror Files has a lot more of these, and the next board president to overreach is already out there somewhere, right now, drafting a violation letter they haven't thought all the way through.